Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good evening, everyone. Okay, we've been studying the Upāli Sutta. This is Sutta number 56 in the Majjhima Nikaya. And in the sutta, Upāli, a householder named Upāli, who's a follower of the Jains, he's depicted as a close disciple of the leader of the Jains, Niganthanataputta. He decides that he will go to debate with the Buddha. And so he comes to the Buddha. He engages the Buddha in a debate over the question of karma, the nature of karma. At the beginning, he has boasted that he's going to defeat and completely demolish the Buddha in this debate. But once he meets with the Buddha, then the Buddha faces up to this challenge, and he answers the questions of Upāli, and he poses counter questions, and after several exchanges, back and forth exchanges between them, he is won over to the Buddha's position. Then the Buddha first urges him not to convert just not to throw away his commitment to the Jains and just to convert instantaneously, but the Buddha urges him to make a thorough investigation. Okay, then after the Buddha says this, then Upāli confirms that he wants to follow the Buddha and the Buddha's teaching, and then the Buddha urges Upāli to continue to support the Jains, because his family has been for a long time a supporter of the Jains, and so the Buddha urges him to continue to support the Jains. And then this inspires even more confidence and trust in Upāli in the Buddha. Then the Buddha gives Upāli a graduated step-by-step Dharma talk, and at the end of the talk there arises in Upāli what is called the Dhammacakku. This is the vision of the Dhamma, the eye of wisdom through which one sees into the essence of the Dhamma. And so with the arising of the vision of Dhamma, Upāli becomes a Sotapanna, a stream enterer. And so going back to the text, page 485, paragraph 18, there arises in Upāli the spotless, immaculate vision of the Dhamma. Then the householder Upāli saw the Dhamma, attained the Dhamma, understood the Dhamma, fathomed the Dhamma. He crossed beyond doubt, did away with perplexity, gained intrepidity or self-confidence, and became independent of others in the teacher's dispensation, in the message of the Buddha. Okay, so Upāli becomes a stream enterer, and then he excuses himself and leaves, departs. Okay, so now we come to paragraph 19. This is beginning the new section. Now we have to remember when we come to this new section that the Buddha has urged Upāli to continue to support the Jains. So what does Upāli do? Okay, he gets up from his seat, He pays homage to the Blessed One, the Buddha, and he returns to his own house. Then he addressed his doorkeeper, the gatekeeper, thus. He says, "Good doorkeeper, from today on, I close my door to the Nigantas and the Nigantis." The Nigantas are the Jain monks, the Nigantis are the Jain nuns. "And I open my door to the Blessed Ones, bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, men lay followers, and women lay followers. If any Niganta, any Jain monastic comes here, tell him thus, 'Wait, Venerable Sir, do not enter. From today on, the householder Upāli has gone over to discipleship under the ascetic Gautama. He has closed his door to the Nigantas and Nigantis, and he has opened it to the Buddhas, bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, men lay followers, and women lay followers. If you need alms, wait here. They will bring it to you here.'" Okay, so that is the instruction that Upāli gives to his gatekeeper. I have to say, my personal suspicion is that the real original discourse to Upāli ended with Upāli gaining the Dhamma eye, the vision of Dhamma. What comes after, I have a suspicion that this was added later by the compilers of the canon. Somehow it just doesn't have the flavor of tolerance that we associate with the Buddha's teaching. And just, I wanted to give you a counterpoint to the Upāli Sutta from the edicts of King Ashoka. You might know of King Ashoka. He was a king of India in perhaps the 3rd century BC, who conquered many parts of India, united them into an empire, and then at a certain point he converted to Buddhism. He embraced Buddhism. And then he had edicts carved in rocks and pillars throughout his kingdom, proclaiming the principles of Buddhism as he understood them, the principles of what he calls Dharma. And one of the most famous of these rock edicts is Rock Edict number 12, which is sometimes called Asoka's proclamation of religious tolerance. This is what the Rock Edict says. King Priyadashi, that was the name, that his proper name. King Priyadashi honors men of all religious communities with gifts and with honors of various kinds, irrespective of whether they are ascetics or householders. But the king does not value either the offering of gifts or the honoring of people so highly as the following, that there should be growth in the essentials of Dharma among men or people of all sects. That is, in the Indian view, the old Indian view, Dhamma was not the special preserve of the Buddha's teaching, but all the sects taught some form of Dhamma, some form of true principles that lead to at least a minimum of right ethical conduct. Okay, then the edict goes on. The growth in the essentials of Dharma is possible in many ways, but its root lies in restraint in regard to speech. This means that there should be no extolling of one's own sect or disparaging of other sects on inappropriate occasions, and that one's speech should be moderate in every case, even on appropriate occasions. On the contrary, Other sects should be duly honored in every way on all occasions. If a person acts in this way, he not only promotes his own sect, but also benefits other sects. But if a person acts otherwise, he not only injures his own sect and disparages other sects with a view to glorifying his sect owing merely to his attachment to it. He injures his own sect very severely by acting in this way. Therefore, restraint in regard to speech is commendable, because people should learn and respect the fundamentals of one another's dharma. The king wishes that persons of all sects become well informed about the doctrines of different religions and acquire pure knowledge. The results of such activities, as expected by me, is the promotion of one's own sect and the glorification of Dharma in other sects. Okay, so this is the sentiment of King Ashoka, which in a way, to my mind, perfectly expresses the spirit of the Buddha's teaching. But now what we're going to see in the rest of the Upāli Sutta, to a great extent, bears testimony to a kind of sense of friction between different sects and what seems to be a subtle, or maybe not so subtle, even a rather gross extolling of one's own sect and a disparagement of the sect of some of others. Okay, so paragraph 19, Upāli tells his gatekeeper, close the door to the Jains, open it to the Buddha's disciples. Okay, now the Niganta Digatapasi. Digatapasi was a Jain monastic, a Jain monk, who was a close disciple of Nigantanataputta, the leader of the Jains. And so Digatapasi has heard, the word spreads around that Upāli has become a disciple of the ascetic Gautama. And so Digatapasi goes to Nigantanataputta and tells him, the householder Upāli has become a disciple of the recluse Gautama, that is the Buddha. Okay, so now Nigantanataputta, he is the Jain, the Jina, the conqueror, the founder of Jainism, a man who's venerated by many people as a holy man, a saint, a wise man. But when he hears this report, he declares, you'll see that the text of the sutta is going to be ridiculing Nigantanataputta, making him seem a bit like a foolish, boastful, boastful man. So he says, it is impossible, Tapasi. It cannot happen that the householder Upāli should become a disciple of the recluse Gautama. But it is possible, it can happen, that the recluse Gautama might become a disciple under the householder Upāli. A second time, a third time, Digatapasi reports this, and a third time, Nigantanataputta rejects this. Okay, so now Digatapasi is going to investigate for himself. So he goes to Upāli's house. The doorkeeper sees him coming in the distance and tells him, wait, Venerable Sir, do not enter. Normally, in the past, when the Jains would come to Upāli's house, the doorkeeper would just immediately open the door to them, and they would go walking into the house, and the doorkeeper would go up and call Upāli, and Upāli would come down to meet the Jain ascetics. But this time the doorkeeper is barring this leading Jain ascetic from entering. He says, "Do not enter. From today, the householder Upāli has gone over to discipleship under the recluse Gautama. He's closed the door to the Jains, including yourself, and open it to the Buddha's disciples. But if you need alms, if you are collecting your alms food, you wait here. I'll tell the people in the kitchen, and they will bring some food out and offer it to you." Okay, so Tigatapasi, he's not on alms round, and so he says, "I don't need alms, friend." And then he goes back to his chief, to Nigantanataputta, and reports what had happened outside the gate. And then at the end of his report, he says, "Didn't I tell you earlier that you shouldn't give permission to the householder Upāli to go to the Buddha and try to refute him? Because the Buddha, the recluse Gautama, is a magician. He knows a converting magic by which he converts the followers of other sects. And now," Tigatapasi says, "now your householder Upāli has been converted by the recluse Gautama with his converting magic." Okay, so then Nigantanataputta, he refuses to believe this. Again, he's depicting him as a kind of almost an obstinate fool who will not accept the idea that he could lose any of his disciples. So he says it's impossible, it can't happen that Upāli will become a disciple of the Buddha, but it's possible that the Buddha will become a disciple of Upāli. This happens 3 times. And then finally, Nigantanataputta says, "I'm going to go myself and find out whether Upāli has become a disciple of the ascetic Gautama." Okay, so now Nigantanataputta, together with a large assembly of his monk disciples, he goes to Upāli's house. Again, the doorkeeper sees them coming in the distance, prohibits them from entering. Then he says, "If you need alms, wait here, and they will bring it to you here." But this time, Nigantanataputta gives instructions to the doorkeeper. He says, "Doorkeeper, go to the householder Upāli and tell him that his teacher, Nigantanataputta, is standing at the door, at the gate, with a large assembly of his disciples, and he wants to see you." Okay, so the doorkeeper goes to the householder Upāli, reports this. Then Upāli tells the doorkeeper, "In that case, prepare some seats in the hall of the central door." It seems that this is, according to the commentary, there were several halls in Upāli's house, and this was the hall in the center of the house. Maybe it was a hall right inside this door along the side of the house, where there was a door in the center of the house. Okay, so the doorkeeper goes back. He gets some seats made ready in the central door, in the hall of the central door, reports to Upāli, and then Upāli comes down. Now we're in paragraph 23. And pay close attention to this. Okay, then the householder Upāli went to the hall of the central door and sat down on the highest, best, chief, and most excellent seat. You could see the text is using a whole series of adjectives. Yeah, in the Pali it says, yang tatta asanang agancha. Aga is best, setang, the chief, uttamang, the highest, panitang, again the best. All of these are words meaning the best, the highest, the most excellent seat. Okay, now if you have any familiarity with Indian religious culture, you know that a householder, a layperson, is never supposed to sit on a higher seat than a renunciant, no matter what the sect might be. Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, always the followers, the lay followers of any of these three religions, including their different branches, will always treat an ascetic, a renunciant, a monastic person of any of the other schools with respect, politeness, reverence. And so we even saw when Upāli was still a follower of the Jains, going to the Buddha with the intention of defeating him in debate, converting the Buddha to the Jain teaching. When Upāli arrives on the scene, this is in paragraph 9 on page 481. When Upāli goes to the Buddha in the mango grove, Pavarika's mango grove, when he approaches the Buddha, he pays homage to the Blessed One. And then he sits down at one side, the polite way. So even though at this point Upāli belongs to a rival teaching, and he thinks the Jain teaching is the true Dhamma, and the Buddha is teaching a false, distorted Dhamma, but still, when he goes to the Buddha, he shows respect to him, he bows down to him, and he sits to one side. But now that Upāli has been won over to the Buddha, and reportedly he's become a Sotapanna, so we would expect him to show respect to the Jain teaching, even though he doesn't accept the Jain teaching anymore, but he should conform to the basic standards of etiquette, politeness, customary in Indian religious culture. But he goes to the central hall and sits down on the chief seat, the highest seat, and then he tells his doorkeeper, go to Nigantanathaputta and tell him that he can enter if he wishes. Okay, so then Nigantanathaputta, together with his assembly, go to the hall of the central door. Okay, now the text tells us, paragraph 24, previously, when the householder Upāli saw the Nigantanathaputta coming in the distance, he used to go out to meet him. This was the polite, this is the polite behavior, the proper behavior towards an ascetic. One goes out, when one sees him coming, one steps out to meet him. Often they will take a bowl of water and wash the feet because the feet will be covered with dust. And one servant will have a towel and dry off the feet. Okay, and then they'll conduct the religious person to a very nice seat. If it's the leader, they'll lead him to the highest, best, chief, most excellent seat. And there they will dust off the seat and invite him to sit down. Okay, but now Upāli remains seated on the highest, best, chief, most excellent seat, and he says to Nigantanathaputta, there are seats, sit down if you wish. Okay, now the text again is going to depict Nigantanathaputta in a bad light. In a way, this is almost, I have to say, it's a little bit like a television situation comedy. So Nigantanathaputta, who is reputedly, if you look at the Jain scriptures, he's depicted as a sage of perfect tranquility, perfect equanimity, one who's completely free of the gross passions, greed, anger, pride, selfishness. But here he gets angry and he says, householder, you are mad. You're an imbecile. You went off saying, I shall refute the recluse Gautama's doctrine, and now you've come back caught by the vast net of his doctrine. Okay, then he's going to use a couple of rather shocking similes to illustrate his perspective on Upāli. He says, it's just as if a man went off to castrate someone. I think in India at that time they would have had eunuchs who would be commissioned to serve in the royal harems, and so they would catch certain people, usually from the lower castes, and then they would castrate them and then assign them to work in the inner palace and the harems. So just as if a man went off to castrate someone and came back castrated himself, that's what the text should read. Or just as if a man went off to put out someone's eyes. The kings would often punish somebody by ordering him to be blinded. And so there would be a man who would be sent off to put out someone's eyes, and he would come back with both of his own eyes put out. And so, householder, you went off saying, I will refute the recluse Gautama's doctrine, and now you've come back caught by the vast net of his doctrine. Householder, you have been converted by the recluse Gautama with his converting magic. They believe that the Buddha was able to use mantras and mystical powers to convert people to his own doctrine. But now Upāli enthusiastically declares his own belief, his own confidence, his own trust in the Buddha. He says, auspicious is that converting magic. Good is that converting magic. Then he says, if my kinsmen and relatives were to be converted by this converting magic, it would be for their welfare and happiness. If the nobles, Brahmins, merchants, workers, if everybody in this world were to be converted by this conversion, it would lead to the welfare and happiness of the whole world. And then he uses a simile. It's a little bit of a strange simile to explain his understanding. Okay, for example, there's an old Brahmin who is advanced in life, and he took as his wife a young Brahmin girl. This would happen in Indian society. Sometimes the Brahmins, if they would lose their first wife, they would go to a good family, and with their wealth, they would purchase a young girl, 15, 16 years old, and take her as their wife. Okay, so he would take a young wife, and he would get her pregnant, and then when she's close to the time of delivery, she might tell him, "Go, Brahmin, buy a young monkey in the market and bring it to me as a playmate for my child." Okay, the Brahmin tells her to wait until she's given birth to the child, but she's insistent. So 3 times she insists. And so the Brahmin, finally, he goes to the market and buys a young male monkey for her. And then she tells him, "Take this young monkey to the dyer and tell him, I want this young male monkey dyed the color called yellow unguent to be pounded and repounded and smoothed out on both sides." Okay, and because his mind is bound to her with love, so though the request is somewhat ridiculous, but he takes the young male monkey to the dyer shop and instructs him to dye the monkey and to smooth it out and pound it and smooth it out. But the dyer tells the Brahmin, this young male monkey will take a dyeing. It's possible to dye him a different color, but he won't take a pounding or a smoothing out. And so Upāli says, the doctrine of the foolish Jains will give delight to fools, but not to the wise, and it will not withstand testing or being smoothed out. Okay, but then on another occasion, the Brahmin takes a pair of garments to the dyer and tells the dyer, I want this pair of garments dyed the color yellow unguent, pounded and repounded and smoothed out on both sides. And then the dyer tells him, this pair of new garments will take a dyeing and a pounding and a smoothing out. And so, Upāli says, the doctrine of the Blessed One, the Buddha, the Arahat, the fully enlightened one, this will give delight to the wise, but not to the fools, and it will withstand testing and being smoothed out. Okay, so then Upāli says to, Niganthanataputta says to Upāli that this assembly and the king know you thus. The householder Upāli, I think it should be, that the king and his assembly know you thus. Yeah, I think the sense should be the king and his assembly know you thus. The householder Upāli is a disciple of Niganthanataputta, that's himself. Whose disciple should we consider you to be? Okay, so when this is said, Then the householder Upāli gets up from his seat, arranges his upper robe on one shoulder. That's a respectful way of arranging the robe. Then he extends his joined hands, joined palms towards the Blessed One. And then he says to Niganthanataputta, in that case, Venerable Sir, hear whose disciple I am. Okay, then he recites a series of verses in praise of the Buddha. I'm not going to go through the verses, they're self-explanatory. But when he finishes the top of page 492, Niganthanataputta uses again a rather derogatory expression. He says, when did you concoct or put together this hymn of praise to the ascetic Gautama householder? Then Upāli says, suppose there were a great heap of many kinds of flowers, and then a clever garland maker or garland maker's apprentice were to knot them into a multicolored garland. So the Blessed One has many praiseworthy qualities, many hundred praiseworthy qualities, and who would not praise the praiseworthy? So with these words, Upāli is extolling the Buddha still again. Okay, then the text ends with a rather dramatic statement. It says that the Niganthanataputta was unable to bear, to endure, to tolerate this honor done to the Blessed One, to the Buddha. And so out of his hatred, envy, anger, disappointment, hot blood gushed from his mouth right on the spot. And that is the end of the sutta. So what do you think? Suki? What do you think? The way the sutta depicts Niganthanataputta.
You already explained.
Well, maybe you have a different opinion.
I agree with you. It just does not seem like even novice, a sage or meditator would not do.
Anybody have a different opinion? Yeah.
I mean, you can sort of, like maybe when, it's sort of like when you first start following Buddhism, I guess you can get caught being disparaging of other.
Yeah. Yeah.
I could sort of identify with Upāli, I guess.
Mm.
Maybe at some stage, when you first absorb the Dharma, or
Oh, I see. So you think that this is Upāli's,
like he still has
it's
something to learn. He's
the enthusiasm of a new convert.
Yeah, and he's so he's disparaging everybody else because he's brand new.
Mm.
He's over enthusiastic. So I could sort of identify with him.
Yes, in the back. Yeah.
What are your thoughts about the final description of the blood gushing from the mouth? Do you take that literally? Do you think
Oh,
that actually happened?
I doubt this very much.
But then doesn't that throw a lot of what is said in the Buddha Sutras into doubt?
What I said, you came a little bit late. What I said at the beginning of the class, it seems to me, my personal opinion, the original sutta, or at least the real record of a discourse that might have taken place, ended, oh, I lost the place, at the point where Upāli gains the eye of the Dhamma and becomes the stream enterer. And then he says, I am very, very busy, I have many duties, and then he departs. Then I suspect that what comes after that could have been added by the compilers of the teachings, maybe some generations later, possibly.
I think an analogy with Christianity.
Yeah,
In the early years, it was subject to persecution. It was just a small sect in competition with many others.
yeah,
And in Buddhism, perhaps when King Ashoka converted to Buddhism, just as in Christianity, I think it was
Constantinople, yeah. Constantine, yeah.
Constantine accepted Christianity, it became the dominant religion. So there was a period of centuries when Buddhism was competing.
Yeah, the competition seems to have been quite stiff between these ascetic communities for support amongst the wealthy merchants, amongst the kings. But still, it's sort of basic principle. This is my own understanding. It's this basic guidelines of Indian religiosity that any disciple of any school is supposed to treat religious people, spiritual leaders, teachers, followers of other sects with courtesy and respect. And even the Buddha instructs Upāli, your family has for long been a supporter of the Jains, so you should continue to give alms to them. But Upāli almost grudgingly consents to give alms, but not showing the common courtesy.
I can't imagine a stream enter acting like this.
Yeah, I find that difficult too.
Maybe it's a lesson.
Excuse me?
Maybe it's an instruction on how not to be,
But I would think that the text would do something to point that out. But as to the point that you made, whether that throws doubt on the other teachings, I would distinguish between what comes in the narrative framework and what is preserved as being the Buddha's actual teachings. And so what is shown to be the Buddha's actual teachings, even this is something that one is not supposed to just accept blindly out of faith, but one should test and examine it. And when I test and examine with my own power of reason what is believed to be the Buddha, what is reported to be the Buddha's teaching, that, as the text says, it takes a pounding, a smoothing, and a smoothing out. In other words, it stands up to examination. But when I take this narrative account here, and even in some of the other suttas, some of it seems doubtful to me. And also what throws further doubt on some of this discussion that takes place, how would this dialogue have been known to the compilers of the texts? Of course, one could say, well, Upāli could have gone later to the Venerable Ananda and told him what took place, or the Buddha, using his divine eye, could have seen what was taking place and told Ananda, this is what is taking place at Upāli's house. But it seems unlikely either that Upāli will go to Ananda and report this discussion, or that the Buddha would think it worthwhile to tell Ananda, this is what is taking place at Upāli's house. Preserve this for posterity, so later generations will know this discussion between Upāli and Nigantanataputta. It seems more likely to me that the compilers of the texts would have tried to imagine to themselves a discussion taking place between Nikantanataputta and Upāli, and this is the way they recorded it, with the aim of depicting Nikantanataputta in a derogatory light. Yeah.
May I ask another question related to this, not related to the sutra, but related to this point about factuality within the sutras?
Yeah, please go ahead.
It's an important point. When Ananda came to the Buddha and asked about having women allowed into the order,
Yeah.
of course, modern folks would not like the answers.
Yeah.
But that's a pretty serious point there.
Yeah.
And it would appear to be that probably is factual. I'm curious as to what your take on that, having studied the Pali Sutras
Yeah.
so extensively. What would your take on that piece be?
This is something where, I can't say with absolute certainty exactly what happened, but what we have to do first is to take the accounts of this incident that have come down in different Buddhist traditions, not only in Pali, but also there are accounts of this incident in the Vinaya or the records of other sects. And so we have to compare these different accounts, see whether they agree, whether there are differences, discrepancies, and that which could show some light or shed some light on the historicity of that incident. But then, even if we just confine ourselves to the Pali account, there seem to be some problems with that story, which shed some doubt upon its historical facticity. I'm not a specialist scholar in that area, but I've read some papers by more specialized scholars which point out that there's a chronological problem with that story. In that story, the one who comes to the Buddha to request the ordination is the Buddha's foster mother, Mahapajapati Gotami. And it's said that this story takes place, I think it's 7 years after the Buddha's enlightenment. This would be when the Buddha is 42 years old. And in the story, Ananda is shown to be the Buddha's personal attendant. Okay, but now we know from other accounts that Ananda became the Buddha's attendant only something like 20 years or 25 years after the Buddha's enlightenment. This would have been when the Buddha was maybe 55 or 60 years old. I think it would be when the Buddha was 55 years old, 20 years after the enlightenment. And so there's a discrepancy on that point there. And then if we look at the relationship of Ananda to the Buddha, one gets the impression that Ananda is about another generation younger than the Buddha, which would mean that Ananda is maybe 20 years younger than the Buddha. So if the Buddha is 42 years old at the time this incident takes place, then Ananda would be 22 years old. So it's possible that he's a monk at that time, because to become a fully ordained monk, one just has to be 20 years old. But it seems unlikely that Ananda would have been the Buddha's personal attendant at such a young age. And so this is a discrepancy. Then there are a few other discrepancies in the story. And so there are problems with that story. I can't say definitely whether that means we reject the story as being unfactual, but
In your mind, basically, it's an open question.
it's an open question, yeah. And it might take, well, it would definitely take scholars who have a wider knowledge of other languages, who have read and studied the different versions preserved in the Chinese Tripitaka. There's a version preserved in the Vinaya. There's a version in a Vinaya preserved in Tibetan. There are perhaps accounts in other Indian languages. So you would have to compare them and examine whether the stories are in complete agreement. And then even if they disagree, whether one of them seems to have, or perhaps a combination of aspects of several might have some historical basis, or perhaps all of them seem to be questionable from a historical point of view. My friend Venerable Analeo, his next project is to compare all of these different accounts of the founding of the Order of Buddhist Nuns. He has these linguistic skills, but this will take him, I think, about two more years to complete. He's not even ready to start it yet, but he will start it next year. Okay, Suki, you have a question?
It's the actual, what's happening in real life, something related to the
Yeah.
story. Like in not my household, but in some of my friends' household, one person is a Buddhist,
Yeah.
and then some other people converting to Christian.
Yeah.
And then there is a conflict in there within the home.
Yeah.
And it's not really, I mean, the Buddha urges not to convert other people to, to Buddhism, or urge them to just examine the Dharma and support other religions.
Yeah.
When you believe in, it's just dilemma, how, I don't know how we should have handled this, or how would you suggest to do it. When you really believe in, for example, karma,
Yeah.
rebirth, and all those Buddhist teachings, and the other person is totally not believing in those,
Yeah.
how can we include everybody?
Mm.
What-
Okay. If there's a family in which some people is a family that's been traditionally Buddhist, and some people convert to Christianity, or a family which has been traditionally Christian and some people convert to.
in most cases these days, it's a traditionally Buddhist family.
Yeah.
So like a grandmother and grandparents.
Okay.
Buddhism.
So this is like a traditional Korean family where they're traditionally following Buddhism, but some of the younger generation convert to Christianity.
Right. And so
I think in a case like this, if the people in the family convert to another religion, what one has to do is to try to establish some kind of religious harmony by making the person who converts see that usually the people who convert to the other religion become somewhat dogmatic, it's maybe intolerant, and denounce the original religious heritage of the family, and maybe try to put pressure on the elders to convert to Christianity. In this case, one has to show the person who's converted to Christianity that we share certain teachings in common, that both Buddhism and Christianity accept at least a similar framework of ethics. Both put a lot of emphasis on helping others, practicing generosity, helping the poor and unfortunate, that we both put emphasis on loving kindness and compassion. And so one could maintain or try to contend with the person who embraces Christianity that if there is a loving God who encourages human beings to practice love and self-sacrifice for the sake of others, is he going to condemn a human being to hell or to purgatory because that human being is following another religion? If that human being is following a religion which teaches ethics that are similar to those of Christianity and practices virtues that are commended by Christianity. If that person is reasonable, then they will have to agree that there is a common core of goodness between Christianity and Buddhism. If the person is insistent, dogmatic, and narrow-minded, then One just has to remain firm and tell that person, maybe try to get that person to see that this narrow dogmatic attitude is actually destructive to their own well-being, because it generates anger, narrowness, a kind of bigotry, which will be harmful to that person and harmful to others who are following that religion. That this is, if we see what goes on in the world, well, throughout history, we see so many religious wars taking place, so much blood has been shed in the name of religion, because even within Christianity, this Christian sect fighting that Christian sect, because each one claims that they have the exclusive truth. And yet if we look at the teaching of Jesus, we could ask whether this kind of attitude would be in accordance with the teaching of Jesus, love your enemy. If the enemy slaps you on your one cheek, turn the other cheek. If you want to be first, put yourself last.
We've done a lot of reading and study, sutra study, and knowledge is really necessary. Kind of.
It's important for people who have claimed to be Buddhists to be practicing Buddhism and following Buddhism. What happens perhaps in traditional Buddhist families is that, sorry to say this, but the elders often don't know Buddhist teaching, don't know what Buddhism is really about. They think it's just, well, just going to the temple on holidays, and sometimes even just they absorb a lot of superstitious practices and believe this is Buddhism. And so then when people embrace Christianity, then they look at their elders and see that they're just following superstition, and they say, that is Buddhism. And then they will condemn it and try to convert them. So what one has to do is to teach the Buddhists, make them understand what are the real teachings of Buddhism. Correct?
Excuse me, one question.
Yeah.
You talked about the Jains. Are there any similarities in their teachings with Buddhism?
There were quite a lot of similarities between Jains and Buddhism. I went through some of these similarities last week. But both of them, both the Jains and Buddhism, accept the idea of samsara, that we are all going through this cycle of rebirths. They accept the idea that the ultimate aim of the religious life is vimukti, or liberation from samsara, nirvana. They accept the idea that what determines a human being's destiny as we move from life to life within samsara is our action, our karma, even though there are some different interpretations between Buddhism and Jainism with respect to karma, but at least the basics are quite similar. They also accept the idea that the force that keeps us in bondage to the round of rebirths are our defilements, the impurities of the mind. And so the task of religious practice is to remove the impurities of the mind. So these are some basic similarities. And what's also interesting is that if one looks at some of the Jain scriptures, one finds passages that are very, very similar to texts from Buddhist texts. There are Jain sutras which have passages that read almost exactly like verses taken from the Dhammapada. If you look at, there's a website, I think it's called Sacred Texts. Maybe the address is www.sacredtext.org or .com. And then you'll find the headings for different religions, and one of them is Jainism. And you look at the Jain scriptures, and if you go through them, you'll see some passages which are very reminiscent of suttas like the Dhammapada, or passages from Sutta Nipata. And also from the spirit of Jainism, one could also see where the Buddhist Vinaya comes from. very minute regulations concerning food, clothing, dwelling places, the observance of communal rituals laid down in the Jain scriptures, almost the way, I mean, of course the rules are different, but in a very similar spirit to that of the Buddhist Vinaya Pitaka. Any further questions or comments? Did you have? Johnny? No. Okay, then we will end for the evening. The next classes we'll have here, I think it's June 23rd and June 30th. Is that too close to the Dhamma retreat, June 30th? I think it's okay. Because we don't have to be preparing every minute of every day. And then the next sutta we'll do two suttas next time. One will be sutta number 59. This one we could go through rather quickly. It won't take long. Called Many Kinds of Feeling. And following that, I will take sutta number 62. This is the Maha Rahula Sutta, the greater discourse of advice to Rahula. It's a very beautiful sutta on meditation. Okay, we'll end for the evening with the sharing of the merits. Okay, so we share the merit with the devas, the nagas, the dragon spirits, the bhutas, the protective spirits, asking them to protect the Dhamma, to protect the world, to protect ourselves and others. Akasata chabumata adeva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata adeva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavata amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata amhehi